This week we're very lucky to have Professor Michael Clarke, who's a highly distinguished zoologist for 30 years and currently leads research at La Trobe and has won billions of awards. So he's fantastic, and I'm just going to welcome him up and let him speak.
Thanks. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I have been interested in the outdoors for a very long time, and found that if you had the right company, you could learn all sorts of things about nature. This is me when I'm about 4, I think. So for about 30 years I've had the privilege of working on a range of extraordinary animals around the planet, mostly on birds, but a few on mammals and reptiles and scorpions and fish. And in that 30 years of experience I have had a reasonably steady flow of my students, because I'm a teacher at, I've been at 3 different universities, including this one, as a lecturer, and I've had students come to me from a Christian background who have a real struggle with their faith and trying to reconcile what they're studying in biology with what they understand from the scriptures. And they come with a bundle of questions, and these are the kind of questions they come to me. Doesn't the Bible say that God created the world in 6 days? How are you gelling what you're telling me about evolutionary biology with what I'm hearing from the pulpit in my church? When you say that the Earth's probably had life on it for 3.5 billion years, hasn't science done away with the need for a creator? Doesn't the Big Bang explain everything anyway? And by the way, what do you believe about Adam and Eve and the fall? These are the sorts of questions typically that I've been asked over my career, often triggered by a student being challenged by a well-meaning member of their congregation who's told them that they couldn't be a real Christian and believe in evolution at the same time. And regrettably, those students who come to see me, some of them have been in crisis, not knowing whether to abandon their studies or abandon their faith. And I think that's a really unfortunate dilemma to have put people in. I don't think it's necessary, and I'm going to try and explain why I don't think that dilemma is necessary. Typically, the sticking point comes to the first 3. My niece is late, but we won't draw attention to that. First 3 chapters of this book seems to be a bit of a sticking point, because the people with crises are reading it in a particular way, those first 3 chapters of Genesis, and they're deciding that it was written, they're making a conclusion that it was written to explain how the world came to be the way it is. And I believe that's misinterpreting the writer's intention profoundly. Before we go there, though, I want to try and illustrate to you, this is not new territory, this apparent so-called conflict. Throughout the centuries since Christ, there have been a number of examples where people have thought a discovery in science has been really threatening to their faith position or their understanding of Scripture. And I want to run through some of those past historic conflicts very briefly to see if you still have a conflict over those passages as well. Because I suspect you mightn't, but you might. And that'll be an education for me. And you may think the examples I'm going to give you are trivial or pedantic or really weird, but they were real issues at a time in our past in Christian history. So I'm going to ask you some very basic questions just to check where you stand in your understanding of how the planet works. And I'm not sure how many of you are scientists or not. I just want to check among you if we've got anybody who believes the world is flat. Okay, we're all individuals. Anyone believe that the world doesn't spin? I just happen to have one with me. And it gives the answer to the first question, so it gives a bit of a giveaway. Anyone think that the world doesn't spin? Okay. Anyone believe that the sun revolves around the earth? Depends on your physics? Okay. And the bottom question's the one I want you to dwell on. Do the answers of those, have you ever thought of them as a crisis for your faith? What you believe about those things as being a trigger of crisis to your faith or your trust in the Scriptures? because for people in the past, they have been. In our Christian tradition, these have been sticking points. And we look at them now and sort of giggle, as we did for our friend who was the lone person who thought the earth was flat. Well, there were people who said Scripture taught us that the earth was flat. If you take Daniel 4:10-11, literally, it implies that if you saw, the king saw a tree of great height at the centre of the earth, reaching with its tops to the sky, and it was visible from the earth's farthest bounds. That assumes a flat earth. The not rotating earth around which the sun revolves. Many Christians early in Christian history got very bound up by this was in contradiction to Chronicles and Ecclesiastes and a whole bunch of verses in the Bible that said the earth is fixed and immovable. And that the Ecclesiastes 1-5 said that the sun rises and goes around the earth. So that's a geocentric view of the universe, and Mars was awkward. They didn't know what to do with Mars on that, so they had it doing loop-the-loops. But anyway, Copernicus helped us with that and said, you may not remember Copernicus, Ptolemy, if you're into a scientist, Ptolemy was pretty cool. He had an idea of a geocentric universe, and his hypothesis ran for 1,400 years, I think it is. That's a fair run. He was wrong, but it was a fairly good run. If I had a hypothesis that lasted 1,400 years, I'd be very proud as a scientist. But someone came up with a better one, and that is how science progresses. One hypothesis gets refuted, and a better explanation is put in its place, and a heliocentric view where actually it's the Earth and Mars that go round the Sun is now the accepted explanation. But for some in the church, this was a crisis because it seemed to contradict Scripture. Ian Gordon, my statistical friend in the back row, pointed this one out to me. For those of you who care anything about maths as much as Ian does, there's a verse in 1 Kings that said the sea was cast of metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits across from rim to rim, ignore the 5 cubits high, and it took a line of 30 cubits to measure round it. Now, some of you will recall back from your Year 9 maths class that to work out the circumference was 2 pi r. You solve that equation and you end up with an answer that's pi equals 3. Close, but no prize. That's pi there, and if you've got the time, Ian will recite it to 100 places. Now, these dilemmas arise if you are choosing to read Scripture as though it is inspired science. Was that the intention of the writer? Is that the primary intent that God wishes us to get from these passages? The size of pi, whether the earth is round, whether the earth spins, are they the key central truths that we're meant to be drawing out of these passages? And I want to try and suggest to you it's not. I'm hoping that's common sense, but sometimes we read Scriptures with a very modern lens. That hasn't always been the case. It seems to have been in 18th, 19th and 20th century fashion. People before that seem to have more nous than us. 1640s, the person who was one of the founders of the Royal Society of London, a very prestigious group of scientists and thinkers, has this wonderful quote. It were happy for us, you've got to get with the language a bit, it were happy for us if we could exempt Scripture from philosophical controversies, if we could be content to let it be perfect for that unto which it was intended, for a rule of faith and obedience, and not to stretch it also to be a judge of such natural truths as are to be found out by our own industry and experience. Very long-winded way of saying, please don't read it as though it's trying to be a textbook on science. And you might think that's a very helpful statement. It sounds fairly novel as science is emerging. We should point out science as a discipline hasn't been invented yet. That came later in the 1800s. Go way back earlier to some of the church fathers, and this was Origen's way back 185 AD. Very, very early in the church's history after Christ. And forgive the sexist language, he's a bloke. And he's trying to make sense of Genesis And right from the beginning, that early days, he's pointing out, what man of intelligence, I ask, will consider the first and second and the third day, in 1 Genesis, in which there are to be both morning and evening existed without sun, moon and stars, while the first day was even without a heaven. And who could be found so silly as to believe that God, after the manner of a farmer, planted trees in a paradise eastward in Eden, as though you've got a picture of God physically taking things out of pots and planting them for Adam and Eve. I do not think anyone will doubt that these are, and this is the key bit, figurative expressions which indicate certain mysteries, I would say profound, deep truths, through a semblance of history. So way back at the very earliest development of our Christian faith, the thinkers of the time were saying, go carefully with these passages. They're figurative language. They're to teach us about theology. That's what they're about, really important aspects of theology. And they arose in a particular time in history, and Genesis, at the time we're thinking about Genesis being written, and there's dispute over precisely when it was written, or bits of it were written, but you're in a Middle Eastern world where there's a heap of competing explanations of how the world came to be the way it is, of competing demigods battling it out for supremacy, enlisting humans as slaves in their battles between one another, of celestial bodies, moon and sun having power over human beings, of creatures on the planet, be they sea monsters or river monsters or ibis or cats having power over you. And into that sort of mixture of all sorts of competing creation stories, you get Genesis. And it's profoundly different. It's a profoundly different worldview. It says there are two realities, as far as I can make it out. It's arguing there are two realities in this world. There is God, and there are the things God has made. And that's it. There's not lots of gods, there's God. And there's the things God has made. And the celestial bodies he's made have no power over you. You don't bow down to the moon and stars. So these things are explicitly listed off in the first chapter of Genesis, not as things that have power over us, but as, here's what we think about the moon and stars. God made them. Here's what we think about the monsters of the sea. God made them. Here's what we think about whether you should bow down to an ibis or not. God made ibis. We don't bow down to ibis. Or the Pharaoh's cat, or anything else. Okay, so it's refuting a worldview around it, and you can see it picks off some of the local creation myths of the time and refutes them and says very profound things about them. It says all the humans were created equal. Not slaves to some, not bosses to others. Everyone created equal. It says that you have a capacity to interact with your Creator. Very weird, different kind of concept. That the Creator chooses to interact with his creation. Another weird concept. So there's a whole bunch of really profound things being said in those first 3 chapters of Genesis that have have nothing to do with science and everything to do with trying to challenge the worldviews of the time and the powers the worldview had. And this is probably for many of you, a familiar illustration. I still find it really helpful in when we think about what kind of explanations the Bible is trying to provide. And I use this analogy. The Bible, in my reading, is about why we are here. It's all about purpose. Science's purpose is to discover how we got to be the way we are. They are, in my head, pretty different kind of questions. Why are we here? As opposed to how did we get to be here? And the illustration I want to use is one of a pot with steam coming off the top of it. If I was to pose you the question, why is steam coming out of the pot? The sciencey nerds amongst this room would be able to give me a quite lengthy mechanistic explanation that there's an acceleration of the particles in that pot due to the heat being applied at the bottom, and some of those molecules are going to change from a liquid form to a gaseous form, and Bob's your uncle, you've got steam. Okay? Terrific mechanistic explanation. Another answer, equally valid to that question, could be, Mike wants a cup of tea. Why is the steam rising from the pot? Because Mike wants a cup of tea. That's a question to do with purpose. Why is steam rising from the pot? Well, I can explain it at a mechanistic level, or I can give you another explanation which is all about purpose. Why is the world the way it is? What's my purpose? Why am I here? Is there any meaning to my life? Are questions the Bible answers. The writers were trying to get in your head about those kinds of questions. They weren't trying to write science. They weren't trying to write science. And those big questions, we need to be mindful if someone says, I have the answer to those big questions and there is no meaning, there is no purpose, that I just happen to be a current conglomeration of subatomic particles that came into existence, I think, a few minutes after the Big Bang. So all the subatomic particles in my body are something like 13.75 billion years old. There's days when it really feels like that too. Can you get your head around that? I struggle with that no new matter's suddenly mysteriously appearing, but the energy and the matter that we have now is all we're ever going to have, and that it came into existence. And it currently happens to be in this form, all those subatomic particles, and has this thing called life. I find that extraordinary. And then I happen to be talking to another agglomeration of subatomic particles that are currently at this form like this and not in a piece of broccoli, which they might be in 100 years' time. That's extraordinary. That's absolutely extraordinary. But I can't go the next step and say that's all there is. For me, that's a step too far, and say what this conglomeration of subatomic particles does to that one actually matters. And the Bible tells us it matters to God. How I treat that other agglomeration of subatomic particles matters. Science can't discern that. It's not equipped to do so. It can't make a judgment on it. That's a statement of philosophy, of ethics, of morals. Albert Einstein in 1930 warned us. He said, science is the wrong place is a dangerous place in which to search for moral basis for living. Einstein, a very clever bloke, he knew the limits of his science, and that wasn't where you were going to find morals. So, just be careful when you hear explanations of things and think they are answering the same question. They may be answering subtly different questions, and the argument I want to put is that the Bible is written to answer the ultimate questions, the purposeful questions. Why are we here? Does it matter what we do? There's a fancy name, if you ever look it up, if you want to Google it, non-overlapping magisteria is the way many scientists think about this. We're answering different kinds of questions. So it's about, was the primary purpose of the creation accounts in Genesis to explain how God created? I would say no. Its primary purpose is to inspire faith, to introduce you to the Creator, and not to explain how we got there. What really frustrates me in the churches I've been part of, most of the time talking about Genesis has been devoted to this question that I'm talking about today, so I'm just continuing the problem, and not focusing on about 13 really big issues that Genesis 1 tells us about. And I'm going to run through them very quickly, all 13 of them. The universe is not an accident, but the work of a creator, not a force. There are two realities. Human beings exist because God chose to make them, to create a universe in which we arose. All human beings were created equal. That's a fairly important point. We have the capacity for relationship with the Creator. Let's dwell on that for a bit. God wishes to be in relationship with us, a fairly extraordinary claim. We're not the centre of the universe. What an important message. The rest of creation is valued by God for its own sake. That has profound implications on how we use the planet. Profound implications. He shares it with us as a gift, not an entitlement. Only God's worthy of worship. The earth belongs to God, not us. We're just tenants. We behave as very bad tenants, but we are just tenants. and we were given, according to Genesis, some really heavy responsibilities to look after this planet. And most bizarrely of all, we have the opportunity to accept that or reject that. I reckon that's 13 fairly important points that we sometimes miss when we start worrying about 6 days or 7 days or whether the world started in 1404 BC. And I think as a faith, we do ourselves a disservice if we suddenly skip past all these really important things that affect how we view our life on the planet. The second most common question I get is around what do I make as an evolutionary biologist of Adam and Eve? I probably should say before I got there, when I was in your spot, I had a real crack at trying to line up the 7 days of creation with the evolutionary record. You very quickly realise it doesn't. And I was just repeating all the mistakes of the part of trying to shoehorn this piece of theology into modern science. So I abandoned that and said, well, that's silly because I'm misreading it. Then we get to Adam and Eve, and the common question you get is, what do you make of Adam and Eve? And how do you interpret it? I want to say at the outset, there are differing positions various Christians have taken about the historicity or not of Adam and Eve. And well-meaning and very faithful people hold different positions. I will try and be as frank as I can with you about what I believe, but I don't want to say this is a test and everyone has to think like me. This is how I have reconciled it in my head as an evolutionary biologist and as a Christian who takes the scriptures seriously. There are some who will take what's referred to as an ahistorical position and say this is an important but purely allegorical theological account conveying really important truths about the way the world is. But there's no connection between biological accounts of human origins and Adam and Eve. Others would take what has been referred to as a proto-historical account, where Adam and Eve are symbolically representative of all humankind and their developing and evolving relationship with a creator. So as a biologist, if I want to communicate with someone in the front row, I need to have the hardware up here and here to have a relationship, to communicate. Some would argue that in our evolutionary history of human beings, we got to a point somewhere there where we had the capacity to relate to a creator. So, not sure when that is, but the people who hold this view could quite imagine that as a species we got to a point where we could relate to the creator in a different way from a land snail could relate to the... We'd have different hardware. And I'm not sure what I think about how land snails relate to the creator, but I'll move on from there. Others take a more historical view and believe that Adam and Eve were actual historical people, two people living in a particular place and time to whom God chose to reveal his purposes. Now, there's all sorts of issues there about the other people on the planet at the time. Were there any? And there's awkward bits in Genesis 4 about that, if you want to have a read of that, because you've got the challenge of Cain's wife. And when Cain's expelled from God's presence, he's worried about what the other people are going to do to him. So it implies there are other people. And then there's some who hold that Adam and Eve are the result of a special miraculous creation event, different from the rest of creation. So some have been labelled this way, old earth creationists. They'll concede that the earth is old, but that Adam and Eve were, I'm going to say parachuted in, sort of put in after the other things had evolved. Special creation from dirt. And then there's others who say, no, I believe in a young earth creationism, so strictly like Archbishop Usher and others, six-day creationist view of how Adam and Eve came to be here. I want to argue that some of those reconcile more easily with the scientific record than others. I think as Christians we need to work out what we believe, and we need to think what the consequences are for the big lessons, the primary lessons of those passages. The primary lessons of those passages. Was the primary lesson of that passage about how humans came to be on the planet, or are the primary lessons about relationships, and I would argue it's the latter. We were made for a relationship with the Creator, and we have the free will to stuff it up. And there are consequences of exercising that free will. That's the bit I think we should focus on, and I don't actually think any of those different views would affect those theological implications. Nobody holding any of those would say human beings seem to have the capacity to reject God. Rejecting God has consequences. They're really important messages from those passages in Genesis. So yes, we have to think about what we think about Adam and Eve, but let's bring it back to how does that change the way I live my life? Similarly, I get asked questions about the fall. What do I think? Hopefully you're all aware the fall's never mentioned in Scripture as the fall. That's something we just put on top of it and we say, well, we all know what we're talking about, don't we, really, when we talk about the fall? And we're mostly talking about a bit of Genesis early on. And again, there are a whole bunch of Christians who are faithful and sincere, who hold quite different positions about what actually happened at the fall. Some, as in category A in believing about Adam and Eve, think this is a story about all people, with profound consequences being conveyed about rebelling against God. As I said, some take Adam and Eve as historical figures whose rebellion actually had consequences for all of humanity thereafter in some sort of federal headship. So there were consequences for people who were innocent people afterwards because of what Adam and Eve did. I think the way I not get round this, but the thing I try and focus on in this story is what are the theological messages of this passage. For me, that rebellion and not doing as God requested has really big and profound implications for our relationship with the Creator. It has profound implications for our relationship with other people. And right smack straight away, you got the bloke blaming the woman. She told me to eat the fruit. Woman blaming the snake. The snake told me to eat the fruit. So things are starting to fall apart instantaneously. It has implications for how we view the rest of the planet and the creatures we share with it, and the way we interact with it. So I guess I want to encourage you, when you read these passages, focus on the theology. Don't try and read it as science. Think about how does it affect how I live my life. And I think there are profound things to be learned. Now, some people say, well, how do I... One of the key issues is what do I believe about whether death existed prior to the fall? Were Adam and Eve immortal? Were all other creatures immortal prior to the fall? Or did death suddenly come? And I found it useful, and I follow... There's a great book, which I'll give you the reference to at the end, by a chemist called Dennis Alexander from Cambridge. And he makes a distinction when we talk about death in the Scriptures. We oscillate between physical, biological death as a dodo death, spiritual death where I'm separated from God, and eternal spiritual death where I am separated from God's presence forever. And he would argue, and I would concur with him, that death appears to be part of normal life both before the fall and after the fall. That gels with the biological record and insights, and he would argue it gels very much with the way Scripture describes death. As God being, if you read the Psalms, Psalm 104:29, he takes away their breath so they die and return to dust. The Lord speaks to Job, pointing out to Job that it's God, who provides food for carnivorous critters like lions and ravens. It seems to be part of God's created order that there is death. It's also interesting to note when you read Genesis closely that Adam and Eve did not physically die after eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, but they did experience a spiritual death. They were separated from God's presence. They were cast out, as the story tells you. I personally don't believe Adam and Eve were immortal beings up to their rebellion. On the contrary, if you read Genesis 3:22, God said that would only happen if they ate from the tree of life. And he expelled them lest they do that from the garden. Lest if they eat from the tree of life, they will live forever, implying they weren't going to live forever in their natural state. So, for me, there are important messages in all these passages in Genesis, and we do ourselves a disservice by trying to shoehorn them into reading them as science. We need, as Christians, to focus on our faith and think about how does that affect how I relate to other people, to my Creator, and to my responsibilities for the planet. Now, I'm watching my time and want to leave some time for questions because I assume there might be a couple. I want to leave you with 3 or 4 take-home messages, and this is one of the most important. Our good mate St Augustine of Hippo. Flowing beards are all the rage, just like in Melbourne. Let every good Christian and true Christian understand that whatever truth may be found, it belongs to their master. We have nothing to fear from science if it is seeking the truth. We believe in a God of truth, not a God of deception, who makes things look different to what they really are. I firmly believe I can do my science as rigorously and as carefully as I can, and I'm never going to discover anything that is going to be contrary, because God is the God of truth, and Jesus said it actually set us free when we knew it. All truth is God's truth. So, don't fear what science has or will discover. My faith was not shattered when I learnt that pi was 3.1. Okay? Do read the Bible. Read it really carefully. Use the best scholarship you can find to understand what it's trying to convey to you about purpose and reason for living. Please don't try and extract scientific insights from Scripture. That wasn't the writer's intent. And finally, harking back to this wonderful Adam and Eve story, I was just really struck when I read it again. And you go straight after the fall. And this is a moving story if you get past the silliness we've talked about. You've got some people who've stuffed up. They're embarrassed. And God the Creator creates God. First off, he says, "Where are you? Where are you?" This is God the Creator who cares about us. And then he creates some garments for them because they're a bit silly and ashamed. If you hear such a whisper, respond to it would be my recommendation. I've found embracing that is worthwhile. I've got lots to learn. There's lots I don't know, but I believe in a merciful God, and He's not finished with me yet. I'm a work in progress. So I'm going to stop there, open it up for questions if you have any. Yes.
I've got 2 questions. Is that alright, or should I just take one question and everybody else?
It's always good to share.
So my first question is, do you think that, well, for me, I find it's sort of like demeaning almost. When I think about evolution, that I evolved from just an animal and just like approach. I'm not science, I'm a commerce student, so I can't really speak as it is.
No, go for your life.
Yeah, I find it's like on an emotional level, it's sort of like, does this feel a little bit demeaning as like, as a person who's made in the image of God, but I just evolved from an animal. Mm-hmm. So that's my first question. And the second question is, when I think about like the heliocentric model and all that stuff, like there's rocks that have been in space, we can see it with our own eyes and all that stuff. But when we look at like evolution, from what I sort of gather, like when I read stuff like the Royal Society of London, like, is questioning neo-Darwinism and had questions about that at one of their last meetings, or something like that. And it does seem to me like to question a lot of the doctrinal underpinnings, like.
Okay. Yep.
I don't know. It doesn't. I don't know. Yeah.
They're two biggies. Okay.
I'm airing my thoughts really openly. So
Absolutely. That's what I hope, and I will share my ignorance openly too, because you will quickly penetrate it. Okay. As a biologist, I am in awe of how we are made, and the mechanism that is accepted by the vast majority of biologists on the planet is that of evolution by natural selection. We argue about the detail because scientists are paid to do so. We are out to make the best explanation we can. But there's extraordinary unity in that explanation. So, I'm not fussed when scientists disagree and replace a geocentric model with a heliocentric model. Terrific, great, we've advanced, we understand things better than we did before. So no worries about that. It happens to be a really elegant theory at the moment that explains more and more about the world, the way the world is. In the last couple of decades, the advances in genomics are just awesome in terms of revealing yet more evidence consistent with Darwin's hypothesis. I'm not a geneticist, but I'm reading a bit of biochemistry, which is just about killing me. But they're describing the genome, and bear with me here, they're describing the genome which is in every one of your cells. So that's a very long molecule, that's an instruction on how to build proteins. They're saying in our genome are a whole bunch of segments of instructions that are the same as very, very, very primitive critters, bacteria. They are like a tool in a garage that has, very early in the evolutionary process, proved to be really useful, and right up to this day humans still have that segment creating that tool in their genome. The really weird part is that the biochemists tell us it's like my garage, where there's a whole bunch of stuff that they've just never thrown away. So littered all in your genome are chunks of DNA we're not using anymore that we picked up back when we were bacteria. So you can actually trace all that stuff forward and look inside the modern cell and say, wow, there are bits in that actually match up with our understanding of how we've evolved. Now, personally, that leaves me in awe, and I don't find that a belittling explanation of how I got here. The more I discover about it, the more in awe I am of the process. So I'm not sure what process you have in mind as to be more awesome. I reckon you've got to have another one if you don't like the way the evolutionary biologists are describing it and saying, oh, that sounds seriously awesome. Well, for me, this sounds seriously awesome. Just even the concept of me being subatomic particles that came out of a big bang, and there's now there and they're all together, and when I'm dead they're not. Boy, that's a source for wonder. And I look out the night sky, 10 to the 22 stars, and we can't see another one like us. I don't want to be a God of the gaps advocate, but boy, that has to make you think. Has to make you think, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was really helpful.
Your second question...
I think you covered most of it. Yeah.
Sorry,
The
okay.
presentation was really good, so yeah, thank you so much.
I feel like I just got an elephant stamp.
Thanks so much, it was really outstanding. I don't know if I think I missed it, but did you suggest which model of Adam and Eve you hold?
No, I fudged it, yeah. Yeah, okay.
And I wanted to know which one you do hold to, and then I potentially have a follow-up question.
Okay. I would oscillate between A and B. I have no trouble thinking and looking at our evolutionary past and saying we have to have achieved, through the evolutionary process, the mechanical hardware to relate to a supreme being. I don't know when that was. But I think the major lessons are theological of those stories.
So if you hold A or B, how do you, I suppose this is something that I struggle with as well, you know, in Romans 5 talking about one man,
yes,
and comparing that to Christ,
yep,
who literally was one man.
Yep, I was reading it this morning. No, I really was. Because it is a sticking point, and I wonder what the key point about it. I think it's an illustration in my head, and it may not serve you well. Paul is trying to make a really important point of the supremacy of Christ, as I understand it. And this unique human being, come God-man, has a unique claim in the history of the universe. And to bolster that story, it seems to me, and you may not like that word bolster, but to flesh out that story to a Jewish audience, just as traditionally we accept sin came through one man, or the first human with the capacity to interact with their creator stuffed it. That's patterns being repeated thereafter. This one man is really different and changes the way we understand the universe. So that's how I guess I'm taking Romans 5 figuratively as well. Yeah. I don't think it's verifying you have to interpret Genesis this one way. I think the important bit to get out of that is the supremacy of Christ. And that's the point Paul's trying to make. And I'm sure it absolutely hit pay dirt with his audience at the time and said, you know, if that's how you understand that, then yep, I can get it. It's a really good illustration. So I don't know if that helps or not. Happy to chat afterwards. Yeah. Yep.
I've encountered the question about, not creation, but about Noah's Ark, and how that so is different to evolution. I guess it's kind of off topic.
No, it's absolutely. It's how do you read Noah's Ark? What do you reckon is the take-home message of the story of Noah?
I think there is a very clear one, and that is all humanity have sinned, but out of God's kindness, He's choosing Noah to be saved from His judgment, God's judgment.
So there's a story of grace in there, and of forgiveness, and of God's faithfulness with dopey humans at times, who just, you know, it's pretty straightforward, almost after Noah stuffs it up again. And you sort of go, wow, this is a patient God.
Yeah.
So I would read that as an allegorical story, possibly local. What was the entire world they knew at that time that was under a flood? And the people of the time took a lesson from it, and they've passed that lesson on to us, and we ignore it at our peril. But I don't need it to be the entire planet went under for me to get that message. My faith doesn't hang on that. So I'm taking it as a really important, significant allegorical story. Just as Jesus used parables and said, I am the bread of life, I don't believe he meant I'm made of yeast and flour. I can use my brain and I can say, I got the picture. Really important. So let's engage our minds when we read those passages and see what is it that God's trying to say to me through this passage, and try to be faithful to that. Yep.
How do we distinguish which parts of the Bible are allegorical and which ones we should interpret for, say, historical context?
I think we have to be as diligent about our Bible study as we are about our other studies, and not be simplistic about it, and acknowledge that sometimes we'll get it wrong, and there are bits that we may not be able to understand at all because we don't have the context. And scholars get to bits and they look at some bits of the Bible, I really don't get, no one's living seems to still get what that bit says, because a whole bunch of local knowledge has been lost. And, you know, there are obvious... Song of Solomon talks about the woman having, you know, a neck like a vaulting tower. Well, okay, she might have had a long neck, but I don't really believe she had a neck like a vaulting tower. So it's a trivial example, but we do engage all the time when we read the Bible. We think to ourselves, what's the style of writing here? Is it poetry? Is it proverb? What is the writer doing? Who were they writing to? What were the conventions of the time? And that requires intellectual engagement. There's no easy way around that. just as you would with your studies. Yep.
What about the idea of that we're made in God's image, but then with evolution, like if some creatures like evolved into humans but some didn't, then is it just those that are made in the image?
God's image, yeah. There's enormous debate about what being made in God's image means. It clearly doesn't mean looking like these two. I don't believe. I don't think we're talking physical. I think we're talking about a capacity to have a relationship. And I don't know where in our evolutionary history that became possible. But I have no qualms that it did. So, but it's really a bit too big a topic. I'm not going to do it justice. There's just so much debate about what being made in the image of God means. But I would have right up at the top of that relationships, having the capacity to have particular kinds of relationships. And one group of subatomic particles just about to cut me off. Last one.
I guess, obviously we've talked a lot about the earliest sections of the Bible, Genesis 1 to 2 and 2:11 specifically. I don't know if there are people here who are on Christian, but if you're thinking about how to approach Christianity, given it kind of it grounds itself in history at some point, at least with Jesus. Often we might start with Genesis and we might start to try and work all of that out. I'm just wondering, as you're moving through the Bible and you're thinking, how would you engage approaching Christianity from the point of view of evidence, if you wouldn't engage with it from the point of view of trying to interpret Genesis one way, seeing that it's like that? Like, what would be a good way for someone to investigate Christianity to find out more about it if they were interested in evidence?
I certainly wouldn't start with Genesis. I would start probably with Psalm 139, which talks about you being known by God when you're in your mother's womb, of a God who didn't sort of wind up the show and then walked away and left it, but that is intimately involved in sustaining it now and is interested in every individual on the planet. That would be my starting point. And then thinking about how do I react to that kind of understanding.
Let's give a big round of applause.
Do you want to listen to or read some more about this, about someone who actually knows what they're talking about? Try these books. They're really good.
That answered my question, so that's great. A big thank you for all of you for coming. We wouldn't have these events if you guys didn't come. Also, there are more events happening each week here on a Thursday. Next week we have a talk on, it's by Sharon Chung, and it's about faith and the creative arts and work and all of that. So that should be really exciting. You can find more information on our Facebook page. Just look up Melbourne Uni Christian Union MUCU forums and it should be there. So please stay around for discussion. Are you going to stay around for